Welcome back to Death Toll Racing. Today we're going to learn some flux-core wire feed welding using a little Century FC90 flux-core welder. I want to give you a little bit of advice. If you're new to welding, you haven't really welded much, or you don't own a welder, this is where I want to give you a little bit of advice just to start off. We're going to go through the basics of flux-core welding for beginners. But before that, if you haven't bought a welder already, I would like to give you some recommendations because I believe you could go down the wrong path here a little bit. I'm not pitching a particular brand, but what I am pitching is something similar to this little Century FC90. This is a flux core only welder. That's all it does. This is what I would recommend. This is an inverter style machine. That's also what I would recommend. The reason for that, it weighs 15 pounds all in, wire, everything. It only weighs 15 pounds. This, after you graduate from doing your flux core welding, is still extremely handy and you'll want to keep it because you'll use it a lot. If you go and buy a welder that can do all of it, thinking that's going to be better, I graduate from flux core, I buy bottles, I can hook them on there, everything's going to be really cool, and Skittles will fall from the sky. I don't want you to do that. I think that's a waste of money. Because those welders are generally speaking going to be heavier, bigger, bulkier, and they're not going to be nearly as versatile as something like this. And you're still going to have to graduate from that welder into something better. So save your money, buy something like this. You can buy a Harbor Freight titanium Flux 125. Those I've heard are very good welders. I actually have one coming so we can do a review on it. But for now, we're going to be using this little Century FC90. This is a little 90 amp welder, and this thing can put down some welds. It is not a joke. It is not a tinker toy, even though it feels like one. Now, if you don't have a welder at all, and you got a hand-me-down, or you know somebody's going to hand you down their old welder or something like that, you can absolutely learn on it, but it's going to be miserable. And let me show you why. I know from experience because this is my very first welder. It's over 30 years old. And I would gladly hand this down to a family member so that they can learn to weld. What's somewhat unique about this thing is I've modified it throughout the years, and the reason I modified it is because it weighs way too freaking much. It is so heavy, and it had this tiny little like 5-foot width on it. It's driven me nuts the whole time. I've done a lot of work with this thing in MIG. Then I converted it with its little suitcase. So this is my wire feed unit now, running on a bunch of extension cables, just running self-shielded wire, gasless flux core wire, like we're going to be learning today. So now, if you've got something like this, that's great. We can learn to weld with it. That's going to be just fine. But once you graduate from this a little bit, I would definitely recommend getting a littler one and then maybe using this one for your MIG, for learning MIG, which you'd be using gas and everything. And then you can graduate from there since you already have it. Otherwise, just avoid these altogether. You don't need them. They're not going to be the greatest MIG welder in the world. Anyway, so if it's free, great. If you find it at a yard sale for 40 bucks or 25 bucks, great. Otherwise, just kind of skip these things altogether. So on the side, you have your chart and everything that gives you some guidelines on setting things up. That's irrelevant right now. What I need to show you is if you're going to be using flux core welding, you need to change the polarity of the machine. And there should be, on your machine, if it's something similar to this, there'll be bus bars on the side that you're just going to basically have to move from either vertical to horizontal or vice versa. And there should be a little chart like this one that tells you which. This one says DC negative flux cord, and what that means is that the tip on your gun, your welding gun here, this is going to be negative. The table is going to be positive. And what that's basically doing is it's actually sending electricity this way up it, and that's how flux core has to work. So if you were to actually watch, and this is why it's extremely hard to film flux core welding, is because it's extremely bright because the electricity is actually running up the wire and into the gun. And if you watch it in really, really slow motion, you can actually see that. That's the direction that the electrons travel. But it's required for flux core welding to be that way. Every other kind of welding you'll do is going to be the opposite of that. It's going to be electrode positive and your ground clamp will be the negative side. Basically everything else you're going to weld, there are a couple exceptions to that, but that's irrelevant right now. Okay, so you have a welder similar to this one, or even a giant one like my favorite welder in the world, my L-Tech MIG-Master 250 over there. It's a ESAB essentially. You need to confirm that your whip is negative and your ground clamp is positive. And you can do that if you don't have any other way of doing it, just with a voltmeter. Just a Harbor Freight voltmeter would be just fine for this. It will work absolutely perfectly for what we're doing. So all you gotta do is turn it on, hook because this should be positive and this should be negative for running flux core welding. MIG welding, it's the opposite of that. But for this, this is what we want. So all you have to do is hook it up that way. I'm trying to get this so you can see it. Pull the trigger, and it should just tell you the voltage without having a minus sign in front of it. If you have a minus sign in front of it, you have your black on the tip and your red on the ground clamp, and there's a minus sign, that means we need to switch your bus bars, because that means it's opposite. So that minus sign will always be if the polarity is actually opposite of the way you hook your cables to it. So red on your ground clamp, black on your tip, or your common on your tip, pull the trigger, and it should not have a negative sign in front of your voltage number. Your first learning, so that you don't have any variables whatsoever, I would recommend using everything that they tell you. You don't need to add a variable in there that you're not going to quite understand what that variable is. The wire isn't terribly expensive. It's not much more than Harbor Freight wire or anything like that. When you get your Harbor Freight welder, get the Harbor Freight wire. That's going to weld. That way their settings and everything are going to be right. There is variance from brand to brand a little bit. It's not a big deal once you're familiar with it, but when you're first learning, you want to eliminate as many variables as humanly possible. So I would highly recommend getting whatever brand welder you have, whatever they're recommending for wire. That way your little table in here for settings is going to be as accurate as possible and eliminate some of those variables. Now, the very next thing that we need, back onto the variables thing, we want everything to be as clean as possible to eliminate variables. The other thing, when you're very, very first starting out and learning, try to find yourself some thicker stuff. We don't need to start dealing with burning through or blowing through right off the bat. We'll get to that later. Find yourself some junk, figure out how to set it on there so you have as much area that you need to weld as possible, so that we can weld it on there. This is 1/4 inch, and that looks like about 3/16. So that's going to be pretty much maxing out the settings on our little tiny welder there, and that's okay. Eventually, you can start doing stuff like this. That was done with that little FC90. You can weld with it. This was also done with that little FC90, and it's just tacked on there, and it's amazingly strong. There we go. And I actually cut it, polished it, and etched it. So you can see there the penetration. It's very, very acceptable, even in a commercial setting, the amount of penetration we got on there with just that little FC90. Kind of amazing. So how to do that, if you actually are curious, is you need to polish it so it's as shiny as possible, and then just rub navel jelly on there. You just kind of want to keep working it in, and eventually the weld ends up being, your heat affected zone is what they'd call that, ends up being a different color. And then I scribed lines down so that you could actually see how much it actually penetrated in there. And it did quite well. This was similar. The settings were actually the same. The only difference on this one is I actually worked the puddle a little bit, which when you're very, very first learning, I don't recommend doing that. You can do that a little later, but you have to really pay attention when you're working the puddle with flux-core, because you can trap the flux inside the weld, and you don't really want to do that. It'll make it not nearly as strong. Amazing how just a few little holes inside there can really, really affect the integrity of your weld. So that's how we're going to weld that one first, so that we can just get familiar with our little machine. Now, to be as realistic as possible, I have this machine plugged in to a 50-foot 12-gauge extension cord, because that's realistic. If you're using a machine like this, most likely you're going to need an extension cord. Now, while you're welding, that's about how far away you're going to want it. So we're going to try to hold that. Now to do that, you're going to want to brace yourself. You're not going to want to try to stand there and weld. That's extremely hard to do. So you want to put your hand on something so that it's steady. And even if it's completely stuck and you're just pivoting, when you're first learning, that's not ideal because you're going to go from a drag to a push. But that's okay. We don't care about making the world's most perfect weld when you're first starting out. You just need to know basically what you're looking at. That's the most important part, and that's the hardest part about welding, is actually seeing what the heck you're doing. And this is where filming sucks, because I can't actually film a very good, it just looks like a ball of light. And it's really unfortunate I don't have a welding camera, but it's just impossible to justify it because they are around $5,000 right now. So if we look in our chart on the inside of my welder, it tells me my settings for welding these materials. This is on the very, very thick side, in fact thicker than the chart even goes. So basically I'm going to take the hottest settings for, which is on, in this situation, 1/8 inch steel, which is 10 gauge essentially. It's actually 11 gauge. We're going to use those settings. And in that it tells us it's 8.5, 8.5. So it's basically square. So we're going to set both of them at 8.5, 8.5. Now it does go higher than that, but it's not necessary. This is going to be just fine. We're just learning here. We don't need to start reinventing the wheel. So I'm going to tack that on there. And again, you see my finger, I'm holding that down. My other thumb is holding the whip, and that's going to hold so that I'm not pushing on there, because as soon as I strike that arc, this thing's going to go all over the place. So I want to brace it on something else. Tack it on there. Now as we weld, that's going to start pulling, so we want to tack it again down lower, braced, and we have our tacks. So we got a little tack there, we got a little tack there. Alright, so we are tacked up and I'm covered up. Welding with flux-core is very, very bright. You want to make sure all your skin is covered. It will burn you, and not in a fun way. It will essentially give you a sunburn, but it's going to skip the tanning process. You're not going to get tan from welding, you're going to get burnt. It doesn't matter what color your skin is, you're going to get burnt. So don't think just because you don't sunburn in the sun that welding with flux-core wire or even MIG or anything like that isn't causing damage to your skin, because it will, and it's not going to be a good day. So definitely cover up. I am known for not covering up, but flux-core welding will make you change your mind on that pretty quick. So I can't film very good, so this is going to look very bad, but I'm going to weigh a weld right here. I'm going to do it slightly dragging the whole way. I'm going to put my finger on the ground, my other finger here, and I'm going to pivot along like this. If you try to do it like this, you're going to be all over the place. It's going to be very, very difficult. You always want to try to brace up. Sometimes when you're welding on cars or something, you'll see guys, they'll just be leaning on something and have the gun tight into them. However you got to do it to be as steady as possible. I find that doing something like this is very, very beneficial. So let's lay this weld in. This is just 8.5, 8.5, just the settings that were listed. Okay, there's your weld. They look really ugly until you wire wheel them off. I would highly recommend getting a wire wheel, or you can get a brush. The brush gets it off eventually. A wire wheel, even something simple like this, will work fairly well. Chipping hammers, the flux isn't quite thick enough, like you see stick welders with their chipping hammers. It's just a wire wheel. I am going to point this out. This is an impact. I recommend using an impact because if it catches, it stops. So it actually works quite well. It keeps you from catching it and throwing this thing across the room. So there's our weld. I got one little pinhole. What that little pinhole is telling us is either our surfaces weren't clean, which they were clean. So that's probably not it. But while I was welding it, I noticed it seems like we had a little bit more wire speed than we really needed. And that's probably because this material is so thick. So the thinner the material, the more the heat will stay right at where you're welding. When it's thicker like this, the heat dissipates real fast. So it's essentially like my wire speed was just a little bit on the fast side. And with flux-core welding, sometimes that will cause little pinholes like that. So what we're gonna do on this next one up here, I'm gonna turn that down a little bit. So you can either turn down the wire speed or turn up the voltage. And I guess I should show you what those are. Your top one is voltage, your bottom one is your wire speed. That'll create, this is what creates amps, this is what creates volts. So you'll see guys sometimes say this is a volt knob, and essentially they're right, but it's not technically correct. This is your wire speed. It is directly connected to your amps, but it's not a set in stone number. The numbers on the outside on this particular machine mean absolutely nothing. They are just a scale of 1 to 10 of its capabilities. They don't have anything to do with inches per minute or anything like that, which if you start reading books and stuff, they're gonna tell you inches per minute. And unfortunately, you're not going to get any of that until you start getting into higher end welders. Like even this Vulcan welder here, that one will actually tell you inches per minute and actual volts, where this is just a scale from 1 to 10. So on the chart, it had us, I actually moved this a little bit. On the chart, it had us at 8.5 and 8.5. So to fix our wire speed being a little bit too fast, so our amps being a little too high, we're actually going to turn the voltage up a little bit. I could have turned the wire speed down a little bit, but turning the voltage up a little bit I feel like is a better scenario because we're welding a thicker material. So we're going to do this next pass with a little bit more voltage, and I think that's going to lay a little bit better weld. That weld looks really good, but I think this one will look a little bit better. So that sounded pretty good. It was definitely hot. I was melting the corners off as we were welding. And that looks pretty good. However, we did get one pinhole again, kind of almost in the same spot, but more at the beginning of this weld. So that still looks pretty good. I actually think that was the opposite problem. I think we had a little bit too much voltage and not enough wire to compensate for it. So I believe we're at 9.5 on the volt scale. I think I'm going to turn up for our very next weld. I'm going to also turn up our wire speed. I think I overly compensated for our voltage there. So I'm going to turn our wire speed up to 9, and I have our voltage at 9.5. And that's how we'll do this one here. You can see how hot that got, how good these little welders work. Let that cool down a little bit. It's getting a little too hot to handle, so I'm going to go ahead and just clamp it. That is a good looking weld. No pinholes, and it's very even. It has a nice shape to it. It's fairly smooth. You can see it actually got a little bit hot right here. where you can see you kind of stopped seeing the grain of the weld and it started looking a little bumpy. That's because it was a little overheated. You can see how red it was down here. So that means our settings are all a little bit too hot for this scenario, and that's because we're so close to this edge. If this were down in the middle or we're welding the inside, I think those settings would have been just about perfect. So your settings are never always going to be perfect for every scenario, but that's a good example of that's a pretty good example of getting a little too hot on there. And it's also, the part is getting hot as well. So on this one, we're going to turn it back down, and I think I'm going to end up right at the factory settings again of 8.5 and 8.5. Being that we're on this outside edge, we started turning it up when we were welding the inside edge when the part was completely cold. Okay. Right, so that's a pretty good looking weld. I got a little bit of slag on the top side that's being stubborn. You can get that off with a little scribe. The problem is you put little scribe marks in your weld. Alright, there we got it off. That's a really good looking weld again. So amazing that I'm doing this with a such an inexpensive welder with no gas. So it looks pretty darn good. Now that you kind of get an idea of travel speed, and I really wish I could film that welding better so that you could see what's happening. Even when you have a good hood, it's not the easiest to see what you're doing with flux-core welding. You can see, and you will learn to see, and really the only way you're going to learn is just keep doing it. Get yourself as much junk as you can and just keep welding it together. If you're having trouble seeing your seam and you're getting off track, your weld's kind of coming down, this, they call it soapstone or limestone, Welders marker or something. There's all sorts of names. Anywhere you can buy this stuff, Home Depot, whatever, will sell this. You can actually color where you want to weld, and that helps you see the line. Obviously that was on top of a weld, but you get the point. If I were to weld, like say I wanted to stack this weld, maybe if we want to turn this over on this side, we want to put an additional weld on top of here, and we want to run our weld right down there. Now it'll be a lot easier to see, and that'll just burn right away. It'll be a lot easier to see while you're welding that. You can find your line there. So now that we're an absolute professional in our little wire feed welder here, running smoothly is what you should be going for. You don't want to start working anything, doing any movements whatsoever. Just run it along. If your welder's set up correctly and everything's clean, it's going to look just like what I did. If you start trying to move around, you're probably going to start getting slag pockets and all that stuff, and you wire wheel it off. You'll have all these not necessarily pinholes like we got in a few of our things. You'll actually get slag inclusions, which are basically when you're moving around, you're moving too quickly, you're trapping that slag inside. So you really want to try to avoid doing that. So they would call what I just did a stringer bead, and then there's all sorts of other patterns you can do. And I would try to learn just doing stringers. And then you can graduate maybe to a J hook or whatever you want to do. You can graduate to that, but I would avoid doing any movements like that. Just follow the line and do stringers. And if everything's set just right, this little bee is just fascinated with this thing. If everything's set just right, I think you're going to learn better. You start doing movements and stuff, there's just too many variables for you to have to think about. And if you're just doing stringer beads, you can really focus on what you're seeing, how the puddle's reacting, and all that stuff. So I would highly recommend just doing stringer beads when you're first learning. Save all the fancy patterns and all that stuff for later down the road. All right, so now I'm going to show you how to stack welds in case you're welding something on your tractor or whatever where you need a very large weld because their plates are thicker. How you can stack a weld using a welder similar to this one. So your very first weld is going to be just like your others. You don't want to try to do this all in one pass. You just want to stack them. You don't want to just start weaving like crazy or doing anything crazy like that. We're just going to weld a stringer bead just like we did on our plate right here, just right across there. This material isn't particularly clean, so we may end up with some problems. This is lucky, I have this. I can actually use as a guide. And then I lose my guide towards the end, so I'm gonna have to pay attention to that. And I wanna make sure I'm not putting my hand on something hot. Otherwise you're gonna have to make some adjustments as you're welding. So I'm gonna start that. I'm gonna just weld a nice little stringer right along there. All right, you saw my little dot at the end? And that is just so that I don't have a crater at the end, because that'll stack up. If I keep running them in the same direction, the end will be a little shy of weld. Now I can't get my wire wheel in there, so we're gonna have to do it this way. This isn't the stiffest brush in the world, so it's struggling a little bit. So we're gonna take our scribe, and if you just scribe right along the edge, our little flux there will just pop right off. Now we can brush away the rest. We have a really nice little weld there. So now, I don't have a problem seeing this, but just for fun, we'll do our little soapstone trick along that edge. And now we can weld our first pass of our multi-layer pass. So that's going to be right here. We're basically going to be essentially welding this weld to this plate. So we're going to center our wire right along that edge. And that's going to be our first pass of our cover bead if we're just doing a 3-pass weld. Okay. We have our little weld there. So I must have jerked a little bit. I got one of those slag inclusions, so I just used the tip of this to get the flux out of there so that we don't weld over it, and hopefully it'll fill in on our next pass. So now we'll do our cover pass. So that one's going to be, I got a little bit more right there. That one's going to be basically going right in between the top of this weld and our rectangular tube there. So we're going to weld right along that line. So this is where you might touch your tip onto here, and if you do that, it's going to stop welding. It's going to stick. If that happens, just pull it off, clean up, and we'll start over. Don't start trying to fight it. It's not going anywhere. It's still going to be there for you to weld. So I'm going to again use this as a little guide, and then I'm going to graduate to my hand out here. Okay. Now we have a nice little weld. That's very strong, and that's more than strong enough for that material. So we essentially have a weld on either side. That is 1/4 inch material. That's 3/16 plate. Our welds are stronger than either one of those. So if we were to pull on this till it broke, it would most likely break right at the top of our weld right there. It could pull the tubing out a little bit, but most likely it's going to tear right at the top of that weld, since that has a lot of structural integrity just because of the shape. Guys, so I'm going to end this one right there. Next video out is going to be doing thinner tubing, and what I'm going to focus on is doing exhaust, because I feel like a lot of guys are going to need some experience doing exhaust, and I'm going to give you some pretty good pointers on doing exhaust with one of those welders, and we're going to try out some stainless flux core wire as well. So hopefully that all works out. But in the meantime, so that you can get ready for the exhaust video, there's quite a few exhaust videos, but check this one out right here. This is an exhaust expander that I made on the channel, and it's a very, very good tool, and it'll make doing exhaust a lot easier, especially if you're an amateur welder, and you should be able to succeed with it. So I want to set everyone up for success, unlike my talking, which I can't do. And then up here is my favorite video I've ever made. That's a 1990 Chevy Caprice 9C1 that I built into a hot rod. It's manual swapped as a D-stroke small block Chevy. I did a lot of mods to it, but I hid the mods so well that you can't really tell I did them. So anyway, check that video out. It's my favorite video I've ever done. I think it's really cool, and I really want some algorithm kicking in on that thing so that we can get that video to take off. So anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you again real soon. Exhaust video, thinner wall material video coming up next.